Well, welcome to the Costume Society of America's conversation on dress. So, the program is the latest in our series of As Seen at the Symposium webinar. My name is Anne Bissonnette, and I will be moderating this evening. We have two speakers, Molly Hartvigsen and Aly Amidei. We will start with Molly and then end with Aly. Molly earned her BS in Family Studies with an emphasis in clothing construction and a minor in business from Brigham Young University. She also holds an MA in Fashion and Textile History from the Fashion Institute of Technology. She currently shares her passion for costume history through the creation of costume pieces for the Utah Opera, as well as teaching in the fashion department at Salt Lake Community College. At CSA's 2023 Symposium, she presented Rose Marie Reid C-Shape Swimsuits. That's a mouthful.
All right. As Anne said, I presented on Rose Marie Reid C-Shape Swimsuits at the conference, and so this is kind of a condensed version of my presentation. At the start of the 19th century, we kind of see a resurgence of recreational swimming and bathing, which left the age-old question of what should I wear to the beach? By the 20th century, the swimsuit had evolved into this woolen knitted tank top and shorts, essentially, and had kind of grown out of the swimwear companies from Jansen and Catalina, who made undergarments. So it's kind of reflective of what the swimsuit became during this time. While it was functional, it would get really wet. Well, obviously, because you're swimming, it would get weighed down by the water, and it would kind of show everything of the figure, which Rose Marie Reid, who I'll refer to as Reid, kind of noticed in her life pursuits. So later on, when her second husband, Jack C. Reid, requested that she make him a swimsuit, she had the idea to make it out of a twill weave fabric, which doesn't have quite as much give as knitted swimsuits. So she used these laces up the side to allow it to function, to get on and off the body, and to also be more form-fitting. Her husband then took it to the Hudson Bay department store, and they were interested in a women's version, and this is what she created. So she extended the trunks and then added a brassiere for coverage of the bust. And here is a picture of that alongside one of her patents for these early designs, in which the patent in the patent, she had it described as the priority that it was form-fitting and was able to be adjustable to a variety of size and figures. During the early years, it was known as a skin tight, and her company was called Reid's Holiday Togs to kind of smooth out some marital conflict. By the mid-1940s, she ended up divorcing Jack and moved the company to California, in which she renamed the company Rose Marie Reid, Inc. Around this time, she was on a buying trip to New York, in which she called the buyer for Lord & Taylor to come over to her hotel and see the swimsuits. And she was instantly taken with the swimsuits. Her name was Marjorie Griswold, and she was later influential in having other buyers be at the opening of Rose Marie Reid, Inc. Reid was a dedicated member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, so she viewed this as the hand of God wanting her company to succeed. By the 1950s, she had centered her business around this idea that all women are different shapes and sizes, and she categorized them into 6 different body types. And here's this cute little quirky illustration kind of highlighting that. Her design philosophy was also that all women should feel as beautiful in a swimsuit as an evening dress. So she chose to represent them in these jewel shapes, which is also highlighted in some of her later advertisements which were called the Jewels of the Sea ad campaigns. To help women find which swimsuit should go with their body type, they had a promotion where figure analysts would travel around the country and help women find swimsuits that best fit them. And these were called she-shape clinics, kind of a play on that word, C-shapes. She was known for her inner construction techniques. She claims to be the first to use inner brassieres, tummy tuck panels, and stay-down legs on swimsuits. My research showed that other companies had used bras before her. The tummy tuck panels and stay-down legs is a little more vague, but she patented a lot of her inner construction, and a lot of thought went into them, how the grain would affect it, what shape and size of the pieces should be. So she was very methodical in how these garments were fitting. This is just to highlight one of her better known designs called the hourglass suit. So it really highlights the hourglass figure that was popular during the 1950s, which then evolved into the doubloon suit, which is very similar. They're very form-fitting, very luxurious fabrics. They're silk. I viewed some velvet ones. So kind of harkening back to that idea of women feeling as comfortable in an evening dress as a swimsuit. She received a lot of recognition for her work. In 1958, she received the Sporting Look of the Year. She tied with Bonnie Cashin. The models behind her are some of her designs. The one on the right was featured in Gidget, which she designed all the swimsuits for, and was a surfing movie from that time period. She retired shortly after this in the 1960s. She received a lot of pressure to design bikinis, and she was adamant that women were too modest for that and decided to retire instead. In her later years, she invested in a wig company and spent time with her 3 children and grandchildren. And then she died in 1978 due to complications from surgery. And thank you.
The same type of presentation by Aly, who is a CSA Costume Design Award winner and teaches at University of Wisconsin-Madison. A costume designer and playwright, Amidei received an BA in theater from Knox College and an MFA in costume design from Carnegie Mellon University. At Symposium, she presented Uptight Alien Queens Wear Wet Leather, Fetish Clothing in Science Fiction Clothing.
Well, hi, I'm Aly Amidei, and this is about half of my presentation from this past summer. When costuming characters for science fiction entertainment, designers can blend any element from the history of clothing or invent entirely original looks. Designers frequently return to styles that are easily recognizable in order to leverage a collective cultural knowledge surrounding those garments. These choices create not only a visual shorthand to be interpreted by the media consumer, but also confirm or subvert existing notions around gender and sexuality as it relates to clothing. A common thread in these fictional worlds is the hypersexualization of female-presenting characters. Fetish clothing, such as dominatrix-style garments, have been a staple in speculative fiction costuming from its infancy. Valerie Steele notes that the dominatrix garment is the single most important fetish costume, and it exerts the greatest influence on contemporary fashion. The way the subversive dominatrix costume and other fetish garments have become readily associated with the genre provides a fascinating exploration for the manner in which science fiction uses costumes, gender, and sexuality to tell a story. A fetish garment, like the dominatrix who wears it, is as much about power as it is about sex. Both command authority. The dominatrix adorns herself in a second skin of leather, PVC, or rubber, and creating a tight-fitting ensemble. Fortunata argues that clothes are so tied to the physical body that clothing automatically carries an erotic charge. But what happens when erotically charged clothing is recontextualized as a costume for a character? And why have so many costume designers drawn inspiration from fetish looks for costuming sci-fi fantasy entertainment. Typically, science fiction and fantasy worlds trend towards the hypersexualization of female characters. As a genre, it was originally written by men and created for the male gaze. Consequently, the costumes regularly emphasize and reveal the female form, even when it is illogical to do so. Monks explains that costumes are symbolic of a series of moral, emotional, and ideological qualities. These in turn reflect, reject, and/or impact accepted social values of the time. Fortunata argues that fashion is thought to have played an active and insidious part in defining the female role. So we can therefore extrapolate that costume for entertainment likewise plays an equally active and insidious role in defining women on screen and off. This brings us to our first example, 1954's Devil Girl from Mars. Martian leader Naya arrives on Earth seeking men to repopulate her dying planet. Naya is clad in a shiny black mini dress with dramatic shoulders and a corseted waist. Steele and Park note that the femme fatale was often dressed in black. According to Steele, both black and red are colors associated with sex and sensuality, but also religion, authority, evil, death, and mourning. Naya's black leather costume is attributed to Ronald Cobb, but I also found sources attributing it to famous Atom Age fetish designer John Sutcliffe, who will also come up in our next example. Naya's headwear bears a resemblance to a Nazi helmet. Steele and Park point out that Nazi uniforms represent totalitarianism, and fashion associated with power and violence is easily fetishized. This also shows up later in many punk subculture costuming and fashion choices, and also in Star Wars. Speaking of Star Wars, Naya's costume is also cited as a potential influence on well-known lover of Pulp Fiction and B-movies George Lucas for Darth Vader's look. According to Roberts, sci-fi films often have a character representing a female dystopia and an evil and inept female ruler. Without the control of men, alien women are things to be feared. They are often coded as something unnatural and well outside of female gender norms. Naya's costume is overtly sexualized, whereas the Earth women are coded as traditionally feminine in modest ladies' fashions of the time. Fortunata argues that modest dressing practices may be tied to women's traditional roles as being the property of fathers and husbands. Naya's immodest skirt length and death ray gun confirm that she is the property of no man. Ultimately, though, she is defeated when an escaped convict who killed his wife sacrifices himself by sabotaging her ship. The wife murderer is made a noble hero, and the unnatural woman is destroyed, never to wear her kinky boots again. While Devil Girl was a minor B movie, The Avengers was the first British show aired on U.S. primetime television, thus exerting a substantial influence on fashion and culture. Black and Driscoll labeled The Avengers as spy-fi, with elements of futurism, historical fiction, and surrealism framing localized spy stories set in an idealized England. Additionally, it is delightfully campy and clever, with remarkably contemporary notions regarding gender. The most popular duo on the show was Steed and Mrs. Emma Peel, played by Diana Rigg. Envisioned by costume designer John Bates, Mrs. Emma Peel's catsuits, in my opinion, are some of the most iconic and impactful costumes of all time. Bates licensed his designs for Mrs. Peel under the Avengers Wear label to be sold in various UK shops. It is argued that her signature look inspired Atom Age designer John Sutcliffe, the King of Kinky. However, there is also evidence that her suits might actually have been made in his shop, which was active at the same time that this show was happening. The popularity of the show and its forward-thinking costumes brought the catsuit and fetish looks into mainstream fashion, so much so that by the early 70s, you could find kink-inspired garments and accessories at Montgomery Ward and similar stores. But the Avengers did not just stop at fetish clothing, but rather infused the entire show with subversiveness. Black and Driscoll quote an associate producer of the show as saying, quote, "We're constantly kinky. If there's a choice between Emma Peel fighting in a wet dress or a dry one, we choose wet." They also note that Mrs. Peel's widow status is evidence that she's had carnal knowledge, but she's never shown having a sexual relationship, despite lots of sexy banter and chemistry with Steed. In contrast, they compare Rigg's role as Peel to her turn as 007's ill-fated wife, Tracy Bond. Quote, For a Bond girl, sex is about Bond, but for Mrs. Peel, while the absence of sex is professional, the presence of sex is also something like a skill. Mrs. Peel uses the multiple sexual resonances of her clothing changes to equip herself for various tasks, just as she uses her skills with music, swords, sciences, or languages. Many cases turn on her capacity to enter a given situation by manipulating sexual expectations. Sex in the Avengers is, in fact, a kind of technological know-how to which Mrs. Peel's clothes are central. One episode in particular is the convergence of sex, fetish, fashion, and Mrs. Peel's skills in manipulating sexual expectations. In 1966, A Touch of Brimstone, Mrs. Peel infiltrates Courtney's villainous den by disguising herself in the Queen of Sin outfit. Oh, and she does this holding a snake. It was banned from ABC in America, but became the most watched episode of The Avengers in Britain. And even in the UK, 38 seconds had to be cut from the infamous whipping scene. You heard me, whipping scene, leaving only 2 whips remaining. The black corset she wears as an item of functional lingerie. Fortunata notes that the corset is linked to intimacy and lovemaking, and its effect on the woman's body renders it a sexualizing device. When paired with the spike punk collar, dramatic makeup, and the snake, it is clear that this is a direct reference to fetish corset culture. When Courtney announces, "She's yours to do with as you will," we are meant to see Peel as a submissive. However, Peel is in disguise and not actually a willing participant in bondage. She takes out the thugs and a whip-wielding Courtney, all while wearing a corset and heels. Her actions confound gendered behavior expectations of a corseted submissive woman, or rather any woman on television at that time. McLaren and Monks note that clothing worn on stage transforms through the act of performance. Similarly, the fetish garment transforms when used as a costume in fantasy entertainment. According to Monks, costume has the power to construct mythologies around garments, which may later be imitated or reimagined by the spectator. This catsuit will almost certainly be tied to Mrs. Emma Peel for many viewers. So much so that when they see a similar catsuit in a sci-fi fantasy property, karate chopping Emma in her Emma Peelers will be conjured up and inform their reading of this new character. Monks refers to this as seeing many actors and many costumes when looking at a costumed actor. Hopefully, these 2 examples have demonstrated how sexualized costumes are used as a storytelling device to reaffirm and subvert gender roles prevalent in society. But obviously, there's much more to unpack here, or rather unlace, about the manner in which these subversive costumes are pervasive in sci-fi fantasy entertainment. Thank you.
I have, looking at both your presentation, and I remember attending Molly's at the conference, but I wasn't there for Aly's, this tight-fitting bathing suit, sea goddess, and the tight-fitting bondage attire. And when you were looking at each other's presentation, did you make connections? I kind of wondered.
Well, I was certainly, when you were talking about the modesty factor of Ms. Reid's design aesthetic, I was thinking about how this is like the opposite of some of that. But also, it's interesting because commonly the dominatrix costume is completely concealing the body. Like there's often very little to no skin, very little skin showing, or very selective skin showing, which you're seeing as well in her. I mean, you'd see less skin in a dominatrix outfit than you would in an average bathing suit. Yet that somehow is acceptable when it's as tight of a garment. Sometimes it's the color choice, the selection of materials, and the context it's being worn in. But I don't know. That's what I thought of.
Yeah, I definitely thought yours was interesting as well. It's this concept of just a second skin and, like you said, context of where it is. So on the beach, it's appropriate to be wearing these form-fitting, kind of revealing things. And I kind of mentioned briefly how the Hollywood starlets would wear them because that was an acceptable practice to promote movies with them being kind of almost scantily clad, but it was a bathing suit, so therefore it was okay. So yeah, it's kind of this idea of just very like showing off the female figure without like showing anything. And like you said, yours was a little more covered. So
still, the figure is central. The body is central to both of your presentation, but understood in very different ways, right?
mm-hmm.
Sorry, I'm gonna mute for a second. Another thing that I found very interesting is that in Molly's presentation, you saw some historical references come in, like the doubloon costume, which had the
Mhm.
melon hose like garment to produce a stronger shape. And that went away. The hourglass silhouette is fine in a beach costume, but we don't see the same type of historical references because obviously women's bodies were not as shown and just promoted in science fiction in dominatrix attire. So have you seen any of these historical references in some of the pieces that you've seen, or were they so contemporary in terms of fashion, like Emma Peel's catsuit, or I shouldn't say it is a catsuit, that
Yeah.
we are detached from history in that way?
Well, I mean, later you see those with fat more like the where the fetish costume infiltrates fashion. Like if you look at Alexander McQueen's or the House of McQueen's costumes, not costumes, they're fashion. There'll be like elements of like fetish mixed with like Elizabethan um, uh, farthingales and course, you know, and like bodices, and they kind of mix it up. And then you'll sometimes see those things show up in film as well. But it like echoing what they see on the runway, they'll pull into film. Like you saw some of like McQueen stuff in the Hunger Games, for example, right? So you'll sometimes see that, but it's often like less like, oh, this is a historical garment that we just made out of leather and then stuck it on screen. You get a little bit less of that because they're trying to futurize it, right? So they kind of remove some of those things, or it's just that they make something that's period and then they put it in a futuristic fabric choice so that it looks removed enough from what we think of as historical garments. But you'll see like in David Lynch's Dune movie from the 80s, you'll see there's a lot of like in one of the houses wears a lot of like fake Elizabethan leather outfits in that film. So sometimes you still see those references floating throughout, but often they'll be on to do. They'll use it as a world building element to pull things from historical fashion and put it in a new context in order to create a new world, if that makes any sense.
I think I agree with you that the leather, the use of leather, anything even historical, if they find that it's strange, they'll turn it into leather, like
Yeah.
Outlander. We see that also with the use of leather. And you just go like, if it wasn't for leather, I don't know where designers would go. We have a really good question. One participant is asking about sound. So um, maybe Madison can try to address the issue of sound with this one individual. But we have Crystal Rose that is asking this following question. What I find intriguing is the use of dominatrix fashion to convey power when typically masculinity is used. So this issue of power, I think, is interesting too. And I'll ask Aly first, but I'll turn it around for Molly afterwards.
Well, let's see. Well, I think part of it is I mean, I'm not an expert in dominatrix culture. I am more of the fashion, but a lot of it is about an agreement between two parties on who has the power in the relationship, and so then a part of that relationship is often about what the person's wearing too. So then when the people are using that like iconographic outfit, right, of the dominatrix outfit, and then putting it on a character on a screen, then we are attributing, if we are aware that we're picking up the signs that that is a like dominatrix outfit, then we're attributing whatever we know as the audience member about a dominatrix relationship to that character, if that makes any sense. So like if we see I'm gonna just use really dorky references. So there's this character named the Baroness in G.I. Joe, and she is often dressed in like vaguely dominatrix, also sort of Nazi fashion at the same time. And it's meant to be, and she's a bad guy, so we pick that up as well. She's a bad guy, but she's a sexy bad guy. So like there's kind of like a mixed metaphor happening there where we we're picking up those threads of like, oh, she's got the an SS uniform style thing that's also really tight and it's leather, and she also has glasses, and she's often telling people they're naughty, and it's all kind of tied into the same coding that we are picking up as audience members, if that makes sense. So even though she is coded very feminine, she also still has masculine traits about her outfit. Like the hat she's wearing is definitely something you would never think of as a woman is wearing. It would be like an SS hat, right? So that would be worn by men. So it's kind of mixing masculinity as well with like super feminine shape. So
Um, okay, so I really loved when you mentioned how certain bodies are fully dressed, but then Emma Peel in that dominatrix outfit is essentially wearing something close to a swimsuit because she
mhm.
is uncovered more than any of the other dominatrix that you've shown. And so it got me to wonder and ask the question from Molly about the need for women in bathing suits to control how their bodies are seen so that it's not like the jersey that you had seen earlier on where every detail shows because it's wet. So there is a certain amount of control and wanting to be seen a certain way, which in a way is very close to this dominatrix. And then I'll ask you other questions that folks have been asking.
Yeah, that's definitely an interesting thought. I haven't necessarily thought of it in that context of wanting to present yourself in a certain way. Like as I talked about throughout the presentation, she had a lot of figure controlling mechanisms, and that could be a way, I guess, of constraining power or showing confidence or something along those lines. Yeah, that is.
I mean, if we think about simply like going into the water and having some kind of jersey, you have nipple definitions, you'll have
Mhm,
a certain amount of, even today, people will have discomfort at times.
mhm,
And here we have Rosemary, like the Reed garments being able to conceal things that
mhm.
would not have been concealed. All right, let me move on to another question because I don't want to dominate the conversation either. So we have Joanna that asked the question. I'd love to hear more about sensory experiences of the materials involved, the feel of the weight of these particular fabric against the skin, the sound of leather or vinyl against itself, and how you might have incorporated that in your research.
I can speak to a little bit about this. I mean, part of a lot of the research that I did about this stuff, I got a lot of input from the actors. Like, I mean, I didn't personally like call up Michelle Pfeiffer and asked her what it was like to be in the Catwoman suit, but she has a lot of her interviews talk about that experience and how like miserable it was basically as the performer. She had to like, it was a whole lot of baby powder to get her in and out of it. They first made the costume where there was no way for her to get in and out of it in order to use the restroom. So like she like basically was like dehydrating herself on set all the time because it was so difficult to get in and out of it. Then they also talked about, in order to the thinking about the visual feeling, the visual look of it, is that whenever she's on camera, they like right when they would call stop, they would basically come and grease her up with a, like they wanted to make the vinyl look, the PVC look shiny at all times. So they would kind of like oil her up with material so that it would really catch the light of the camera. So which is interesting. And I just, every time I watch a movie, and it's such an amazing performance, and she actually learned how to use that whip as well. I mean, so she uh and you just can only imagine how uncomfortable she was the entire time. Another example of my research was the Jerry Ryan in seven as the Seven of Nine, who's a Borg um, in Star Trek, and her first outfit in Voyager was miserable as well for her. I mean, she had like an internal corseted garment to show that like there was like a compression garment underneath her, and they like, and she just talks about, and she's in a skin tight kind of cat suit that's out of a stretchy like lycra that is very revealing, so much so it was so revealing, too revealing, that they had to remake it because there was some unfortunate scenes early on showing a little too much of her her business on camera. So like, there was no modesty there, I guess, but covered head to toe in a way. And just like thinking about the actors being miserable, but then the actors are doing this as a job, not because they are gaining any pleasure from it, as opposed to the people who use these as a part of their lifestyle or their as a pleasure seeking thing. They for the very same reasons that the actors found these garments uncomfortable, many people would find those garments pleasurable or desirable to have that same experience. So it's kind of interesting because it's the opposite. It's like, this is not this is a costume and a meant for storytelling, not what it was its original intended function, which was an object around a sex object. So
Molly, you mentioned how some of these bathing suits were made out of satin or velvet. I think you said velvet.
Yeah, I did. Yes, yeah. So they used a wide variety of fabric types that I would not consider functional compared to today's bathing suits, which are made of like spandex and lycra and stuff. Um, but like in regards to her first swimsuit, which was made of a twill weave, one of the extant garments that I viewed, it was like frayed in the crotch area, so there is friction that is happening there over time. And then as far as like, she also had a gold lame swimsuit, which she tested to make sure was compatible for seawear or seawater. But I mean, I haven't personally worn those garments made of gold and velvet, so I've never swam in those, so I can't personally attest to what that would be like. But sunbathing is also a popular activity. She had an advertisement, one for sea, one for psychology, and like one just because. So this idea of you can have one just to swim in, and then you can have one to just kind of lounge around in and look really beautiful in, which is probably where some of those impractical bathing fabrics come into play.
Well, that was my thing. Maybe they weren't meant to really be swimming
Right.
that much.
Yeah. Hmm.
It is in a way a performance garment,
Right.
the bathing suit as a performance garment.
Hmm.
Right.
Yeah.
We have a few comments in the chat that also we'll get to a question, but a few of them mentioned different details that they encountered that maybe you encountered in your research too. Aly says, yes, you answered that Diana Rigg requested that they stop making her cat suits in leather and make them more out of stretchy materials so that she could move and fight, which is a really good thing that they listened to her. Jean will also included a comment that says the visual makes me wonder about the fitted thermal bands of Jojovic. I can't say her name. I guess this is where the Fifth Element came
yeah,
in.
I think that was Gaultier, wasn't that?
Yeah.
He designed that costume as well. So
So he also borrowed from that same imagery of popular culture and
mhm.
goateed it to the nine. One of the question I had about Seven of Nine is that you mentioned that it was very tight. So I remember early on, I could be wrong, that we could see her ribs, but
Mhm.
were the ribs a corset put under to accentuate this body consciousness?
Was a structure underneath the garment that was like meant to be not her ribs, but like the idea was there's some sort of structural garment that had to help keep her body together more or less because of all the board components that were still in her system. So it's kind of, they came up with some weird idea, but of course then they lose it all later because now she doesn't now, because this same character is now in the recent Picard series that are on Paramount Plus, and now she's casual. She's like elevate. She doesn't have to wear tight pants anymore. She just wears like khakis and like coats and whatever, just a casual uniform. So she's got moved past the need to be skin tight, but she still could pull it off though. So
She still rocks and she doesn't
yeah,
need the
she's
catsuit.
amazing.
All right, well, we have Kristen who asked the question. She said, how are the swimsuits and dominatrix garbs both functional and non-functional for the acts that they're supposed to be undertaken when wearing them? which brings us back to that idea of performance, I guess, in the non-functional.
Right, yeah. I mean, I think kind of going back a little to, I mean, I said earlier, so some of the fabrics were a little more luxurious than others, so that's not necessarily the most practical for swimming. It's functional in that she was very concerned about things being water repellent. She did make sure they were tested by swimmers so that they could swim. One of the patents she had was for the band to be like cut on a bias so it could be slipped on and off and had more freedom of movement for swimming, and a lot of like adjustment features. So there's a variety of like features she thought through to help make swimming more functional. But when you look at some of the garments, they like as said before, compared to today, they are very elaborate. And she was comparing these to evening dresses, which is not a functional thing for swimming. You don't go swimming in your evening dresses. So there is some level of it's just beautiful. So.
One of the issues that I wondered, Molly, if you could ask, I don't know because you have made garments and your training is in the making. If you try to look at these patterns to attempt to reproduce, because I think people like me, other folks who are used to looking in 1950s evening suits, for example, the discomfort of this inner construction tends to get to us for those of
Right.
us who are mindful about comfort.
Mm-hmm.
But if this person, Rose Marie Reid, meant for them to be used and see, for example, the bias in from the chest down, I assume, because the rest was padded and controlled. Have you
Mm-hmm.
tried to reproduce them to kind of test out this technology that she was able to devise through cut and construction?
I haven't. I mean, that is a good idea. She has lots of her patent illustrations from the garments I have viewed. That is definitely a good way to view garments, I've learned through making them. It shows you different aspects that you don't necessarily see or understand just through the reading or the viewing of different resource materials. So that is definitely a good idea to see how these were functioning and how the feature would be beneficial to swimming.
I really admire the fact that she had this 6 different diamond shapes. And I mean, it's still a problem to find bathing suit, and some
Mhm.
companies still use that sort of uh, tactic to try to sell people, but I seldom see much difference in what they're trying to propose to us. So I was curious to to see if we had thought about how we could use these types of patterns to create garments today that move with you but are still constructed in a way to adapt to different figures. Aly, I was asking all these questions of Molly, so I don't know if you had anything to say with the last question that I asked between making garments that are meant to be functional or non-functional, and how they supported the actors in that.
Well, I mean, it's interesting with costumes, you have a lot of extra complications because sometimes you have to often you have to make multiples of the costumes. So, because you need them for the stunt person, you need them for the actor, you need them to be able to, like, oh, she needs to be able to fly in this version, she has to flip in this version, etc. So they do these multiple versions of these things. So sometimes they, uh, I'm not sure if I'm answering this question correctly, but like the function of of what we're putting on the stage or the screen is going to shift based on what they need to do in the scene. So even then, like what you're seeing, hmm, it's you're not always seeing like the truth there. We can hide, we can fake moments, we can hide them, and so like the function of the the storytelling is what's the most important thing, and not necessarily like the original function of the costume. So like I'm trying to think of a good example of this. Like sometimes they would have things that would be like really restrictive and uncomfortable for an actor to wear, but they look amazing. But then they might have less restrictive versions for some scenes where they need to be more physical, right? Or they're just completely lying the whole time, and you're often seeing a body double for some scenes as well. So like someone might be, for like an example would be of a character that wears a cat suit almost all the time, which is the Black Widow Scarlett Johansson Black Widow, right? Well, so in the second Avengers movie, she was like 6 weeks, well, she was pregnant, I think like 3 to 4 months pregnant, but you can't tell that because they shot her from very specific angles and then used a body double, a stunt double, whenever you had to see like, oh, she's cute and sexy, like her figure, not like she has a baby bump and is still cute and sexy, right? But like, so they would fake it. I don't know if I'm answering this right, but like that's how we, the function of the costume is going to shift based on what we need to do in the scene.
There's way more abilities to cover things up compared to Molly and the bathing suits. So the fact that they use construction there to try to enable people to move more than they would in an evening dress is commendable. But you can't hide as you would in the movies. I have another good question that came up. So, is there anything that you spoke about during the symposium when you did your extended presentation that you didn't mention yet that didn't make it into the symposium? Because even with the symposium, you have to fit it into certain amount of time and you have to present, but that you wish people had knew about your research, how you conducted the research, little bits and pieces that didn't fit into your narrative, but that are still something that our viewers might be interested in.
Yeah, there was a lot of things. I took this from a 40-page paper down to like 10 or 12. Trying to now recall everything that I cut from that. Some of the things included, I didn't really highlight her advertisements as much. Just as much as she was a brilliant designer, she was also a brilliant saleswoman. So I think one of the questions that had come up during symposium was if she coordinated with other people in her selling. So she had a beach boutique where she coordinated with other companies, including like Helena Rubinstein, some makeup and beachwear, like caps and stuff. She was also really good with ad campaigns. So like there was like a little blue ribbon that people could ask about, and they'd be like, oh, Rose Marie Reid's going to be here this coming weekend. So the salespeople would have those. So she was very involved in her advertising as well as the designing.
I wondered about, since those garments, especially the top portion of the garments, were so fitted, looking like evening garments, if she
Mm-hmm.
had extra garments that she sold, like beach cover up, where you cover the skirt portion, and there you go, you can be useful for daytime attire.
She didn't really branch out too much from swimwear. She briefly in Canada did a house coat line to kind of get her through a winter season. That didn't really continue. But as far as like beach cover-ups, other than this kind of like beach boutique theme, she didn't have anything outside of swimsuits. Like she solely focused on swimsuits.
As focused, she knew her
Yeah.
business.
Yep.
How about you, Aly? Are there things that didn't make it into the CSA that are interesting research tidbits?
I mean, I had like about a 2 hour presentation that I had to cut down to 20 minutes. But probably like I started the presentation in Salt Lake City with announcing that I wouldn't be talking about Barbarella, and don't ask about Barbarella because like that's a whole like chapter in and of itself. And I think I actually would classify that as a space harem look rather than alien queens wear wet leather look. And so much so that I'm actually talking about space harem at critical costume in March is what I'll be presenting on there. So about Orientalism and Flash Gordon. But so yeah, there's so much stuff to talk about, and I'm thinking this is just a larger topic I'm going to keep going into, because there's tons and tons of stuff that I didn't even get to touch on. Yeah. So there's a lot. I will bore you with it. If you want to hear all about it, I will tell you all
Even
about
when you started and you showed the Harrison Ford character in Star Wars and pictures of what may have been cowboys and cowboys in movies, in early movies, that by itself is a fantastic, fascinating. So even looking at one iconic piece could fill
it.
an
Right.
entire presentation. So
Yeah.
right now, what are you working on? So you're working mostly on the Barbarella Space
Yeah,
Harem,
I'm not
or
even
have you?
once again not talking about Barbarella because it's just too much. I'm like right now what I'm researching is uh because Flash Gordon, the original comic book or like cartoon strip, and then the original like short film serial. It was like a serial that used to play before. It was kind of like a longest trailer that used to serialized movies that would play before other movies. So, and there would be like short little like 10-minute clips that people like kids and stuff would go back every week to see. Mostly they'd go to see the serial, not to see the actual movie that was on afterwards. And so then those were then eventually cut into larger movies too. Um, and they started Buster Crabbe, who was a Olympic swimmer. Then later there were three of those like large serial series, and then there was I think it was 1980, a ridiculous. I love it so much that here's my childhood Flash Gordon book on my shelf behind me in my very adult office. Um, that was made by Dino De Laurentiis. It was an Italian producer, and there's a bunch of ridiculousness in it. But so I'm writing about that and the use of Orientalism in it, because it has a lot of like when the original comic came out and when the movie came out, there's a lot of like yellow face characters and a lot of like aliens as exotic, using a lot of Asian inspired clothing and makeup and yellow face looks on the characters. So I'm looking into how like science fiction uses a lot of Orientalism in it. Because if you think of like Star Wars is like a huge uh, this is huge in Star Wars, and George Lucas was a huge lover of B movies and loved serials. Like he tried to make Flash Gordon and then was told no, and then made Star Wars. So like we know that he loved Flash Gordon. And so then when you see all of that, like all of the like the Japanese Jedi looks and all that stuff in his movies, you kind of get like, oh, he has this whole this is embedded in him, his visual Rolodex basically from a young age, because he watched all these serials. And so I just, in that has like carried through so much of science fiction, and all traces back to Flash Gordon, basically. So that's what I'm talking about right now.
Nice. How about you, Molly? Or have you continued to do some research on Rosemary or other people around her, or are you venturing into other areas of research?
I'm not really actively doing any research currently. When I finish this paper, there's definitely some like points where I would like to continue research. I just don't currently have the time or resources to do so. So mostly just focusing on working and making costumes at the moment.
So I gathered there's lots of people. I'm looking at the names of the people who came in for the webinars, and I know that some people are creative designers and the design for the theater. So when Aly, when your passion for the subject comes up, how does it influence your work? Do you end up like going crazy yourself on Flash Gordon inspired things? It's part of
Oh,
your Rolodex.
I will try to embed as much Flash Gordon in anything I can do as possible. But doing it in a culturally competent way. I don't try. I try very hard to not use what is harmful about the design choices in that film. And most of that is tied to the identity of the actors not being. Although I still think it would be difficult to make a modern Flash Gordon film because of the the harmful Asian stereotypes that are in the original source material. So because it all came out during like Yellow Scare and all that, I mean, there's a lot of yellow apparel embedded in the text, right? So, but visually, I mean, I think some of the choices that were made design wise, I think are just really exciting and visually stunning. So I use it as I often use it as a reference when I'm doing something, mostly because at that point, a lot of science fiction up until that point was all very neutrals and slick and blacks and whites and silvers and shiny. And then here, this film came along and it was almost in direct dialogue with the visuals of Star Wars, which were very slick and slick looking or very like rural looking, right? They had like the gauzy stuff or they had like disco or military kind of looks. Whereas this was just like color everywhere, and like Brian Blessed in a gold bikini with like wings, and I mean it was just like crazy stuff. Everything is like so beaded and just very luscious, over the top. And so it's kind of an interesting comparison of like looking at the just different science fiction films of the 70s and early 80s, and you just got wildly different looks. And I just like to try to steal all that stuff all the time. And then also the thing I like to do is to those things are like kind of embedded in our, like those of us that watch that stuff as a kid or now, we have that kind of in our back of our head. So if you make subtle references or even not so subtle references to that on stage, then they bring that baggage of what they thought of that other character to this new character. And sometimes you can use that in interesting ways, like when you make a reference and then the audience is going to bring that reference to this new character, which can be really fun.
I don't know if we have much time because there's 5 minutes left, but I also wanted to ask about the issue of age. A lot of the science fiction that was produced early was for a really young sort of children and teenage. So the idea of what's sexy and what is exotic was one thing, but then it's sort of seemed to evolve into a very adult-like, even the Batman movies with the Catwoman. It seemed there's a discrepancy between the public it's meant for and the folks who actually look at it and find it really titillating. So I don't know if you address the issue of age and audiences in your research.
Yeah, I mean, like for sure, because I'm looking at that with the Flash Gordon stuff right now, is that it was meant for children, but it was very like sexually provocative clothing choices, right? So, I mean, it was still within the realm of like, I mean, they weren't going to get censored by the film, with the film organization, or I can't remember the name of that. But like, there's still a lot of midriffs on things, and like Buster Crabbe took his shirt off whenever he could, like thank God, right? But anyway, you know what I mean? Like there was just like there didn't need to be that much skin or sex, but then I mean, I feel like that's not changed even today, right? But I think it's a lot of these things are trying to play at two levels too, right? They're trying to play for the kids who are going to see it, and then like the parents that have to come watch it too. But also like a lot of these are like science fiction audiences are for many years had been overwhelmingly male and in a younger, like a 13 to like 32 range. But now, like a lot of when I was doing research for this, like 50% of like sci-fi channels audiences is women now, like, so it's not just science fiction is loved by, it's not a gender divide anymore. It's kind of an equal affection for the genre. And I think you're seeing that in a little bit more fully realized female characters that aren't just there for titillation as well.
Maybe we'll expect the hero in the catsuit, the male hero in the catsuit soon,
Yes.
with those demographics.
Yes.
I do thank you both. This was extreme. It's a really great way to share the knowledge that some people didn't get to see at the symposium, or even ask further questions. That the symposium is not as great for exchanges of ideas because you have your spiel to give, and then there's lots of people in the room, and think on their feet is much harder. So thank you so much for talking about your research, for sharing that and answering questions. Thank you for attending, everyone. And at this point, I forgot what I'm supposed to say, but I think I'm just supposed to say thank you.